The air was thick with tension as the doors of the Bern Synod Hall slammed shut, echoing through the cold stone corridors. Calvin, the young and ambitious reformer, stood outside, his heart pounding in his chest. The meeting had just ended, and the outcome was far from what he had hoped for. His efforts to bridge the gap between the Swiss and Strasbourg churches had backfired, and now he was left to face the consequences. Calvin had always been a man of strong convictions. He believed that the Reformation was a sacred cause, one that required unwavering dedication and a willingness to stand against the tide. But today, he felt the weight of his failures more than ever. The Strasburgers, who had once been his allies, now looked at him with suspicion. The Bernese government, which had once been his supporter, had turned against him. And worst of all, his friend and fellow reformer, William Farel, was now under a cloud of suspicion. The problem had started with the Eucharist, the central sacrament of the Christian Church. Calvin had tried to find a common ground between the Swiss and the Strasburgers, but his efforts had only strengthened the Lutheran influence in Bern. The Bernese government, which had initially leaned towards the Zwinglian view, now preferred the Lutheran interpretation. This shift was a blow to Calvin's hopes for a united Protestant front, but the issues didn't stop there. The Bern Synod had also raised questions about the Genevan Church's use of terms like Trinity and person. Calvin and his fellow Genevans had long avoided these terms, seeing them as unnecessary and potentially misleading. However, the Strasbourg leaders and the Bernese government insisted that these terms were essential for maintaining unity and suppressing controversies. Calvin found himself in a difficult position. He had to decide whether to compromise his principles or risk further alienation from the broader Protestant movement. The second issue was even more personal. The Genevans had been accused of equating Christ with Jehovah, a charge that, while not entirely unfounded, was a source of deep controversy. Calvin and his colleagues had to explain their position, and the explanation was met with mixed reactions. While some were satisfied, others remained skeptical, and the tension only grew. Calvin's frustration was palpable. He had written to his friend Martin Bucer, expressing his displeasure at the situation. Bucer's craftiness, as Calvin put it, had only made things worse. Calvin felt that Bucer had manipulated the situation to favor the Lutherans, and this betrayal stung deeply. But the real blow came when the Bernese government demanded that the Genevans accept the terms Trinity and person or face exclusion from the broader Protestant community. Calvin, who had always been a strong advocate for the freedom of conscience, found himself in a bind. He could not simply force his followers to use terms they found objectionable, but he also could not afford to isolate Geneva from the rest of the Protestant world. The Genevans were forced to make a public declaration, agreeing to use the terms Trinity and person, and teach others not to fear them. They promised to correct those who refused to use the terms, but they also vowed to tolerate them and not excommunicate them. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and Calvin knew that this compromise would be seen as a defeat. The situation in Geneva was already tense. The people were growing restless, and the preachers were under increasing scrutiny. The news from Bern only added to the mistrust. The Genevans were being asked to swear an oath to a new confession, one that was seen as a departure from their own principles. The reformers, including Calvin and Farel, were accused of being too strict and too rigid, and the atmosphere was thick with suspicion and resentment. As Calvin and Farel returned to Geneva, they tried to present a positive face. They reported to the Council of 200, emphasizing the importance of living according to the law and commandments of the Lord and the need for harmony with the Bernese government. They even mentioned the 2 ducats they had received for their journey, a small gesture that they hoped would ease the tension, but the damage was already done. The winter in Geneva was a period of unrest, and the spring brought a wave of resentment that threatened to engulf the reformers. The issues of church practices, such as the observance of feasts, the use of fonts, and the wearing of hair adornments at weddings, became the focal points of the growing conflict. These seemingly minor differences were the spark that set the city ablaze. Calvin stood at the crossroads, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with danger. The storm was brewing, and he could only hope that his faith and determination would see him through. But as the first rumblings of the coming tempest echoed through the city, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a grave mistake. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The battle for the soul of Geneva was far from over. In 1538, John Calvin, the prominent reformer, faced a significant challenge in Geneva. This city, which he had helped transform, suddenly seemed to turn against him. The reasons behind this dramatic shift are complex and intertwined with the political and religious tensions of the time. Bern, a powerful city-state, played a crucial role in this drama. Bern had been supportive of Geneva's Reformation, but as Calvin's influence grew, so did Bern's concerns. Bern was inclined towards Lutheranism, a more conservative and traditional form of Protestantism, while Calvin's approach was more radical and biblically focused. This theological difference created friction. Peter Kuntz, a key figure in Bern's religious leadership, saw Calvin as a threat. Kuntz believed that Calvin's ideas were too radical and could undermine the stability that Bern sought in its territories. He worked to isolate Geneva, forbidding its preachers from interacting with Bern's clergy, and even blocking the appointment of Geneva-friendly pastors in Bern-controlled areas. Calvin, feeling the pressure, wrote to his friend Martin Bucer, complaining about the unfair treatment. Bern's motivations were not just religious. They had political ambitions for Geneva, hoping to integrate it into their sphere of influence. However, they feared that Calvin's vision for a theocratic state, where religious and civil authority were closely aligned, would make Geneva too independent and difficult to control. This fear was heightened by the growing number of French-speaking reformers in Geneva, whom Bern saw as potential agents of French influence. Despite these tensions, the Genevans initially seemed to support Calvin. However, when Bern demanded that Geneva adopt certain religious ceremonies, the Genevan Council, newly elected in February 1538, surprisingly agreed. This decision was puzzling, given Geneva's recent struggle for independence and the Council's earlier support for Calvin's reforms. The reasons for this decision are complex. Some suggest it was a strategic move by the Council to assert its authority over the clergy. Calvin had proposed the creation of a consistory, a body that would oversee church discipline. But the Council saw this as a threat to its own power. By accepting Bern's demands, the Council might have hoped to undermine Calvin's influence and assert its own control over religious matters. However, the Council's decision was also influenced by broader political considerations. Geneva was a small city, and Bern's support was crucial for its security and prosperity. The Council may have believed that complying with Bern's demands would secure their city's future, even if it meant compromising on some of Calvin's reforms. For Calvin, this decision was a betrayal. He saw the Bern ceremonies as a step backward, a return to the very practices he had worked hard to eliminate. His refusal to accept these ceremonies was not just a matter of principle. It was a stand for the purity of the faith and the independence of the Church. This stubborn resistance ultimately led to his expulsion from Geneva in April 1538. Calvin's expulsion was a turning point. It was a painful event, but it also transformed him. The experience of rejection and exile made him stronger and more determined. When he was recalled to Geneva in 1541, he returned with a renewed sense of purpose and a more refined vision for the city. The conflict with Bern and the Genevan Council had hardened his resolve and prepared him for the challenges ahead. The events of 1538 were not just about theological differences or political maneuvering. They were about the struggle for the soul of Geneva, a city that was at the heart of the Reformation. Calvin's resilience and the Council's pragmatism set the stage for a new chapter in Geneva's history, one where the ideals of the Reformation would be tested and ultimately shaped by the complex interplay of faith, politics, and human will. The conflict between the people of Geneva and John Calvin was heating up. For the Genevans, the ceremonies and practices demanded by Bern were a symbol of their opposition to Calvin's strict religious system. They didn't want to be a testing ground for Calvin's theology. They just wanted to live as free citizens, in harmony with the basic principles of the Reformation, but without the intense demands and constant scrutiny that Calvin's vision entailed. Calvin, on the other hand, had a different idea. He believed in a life where faith and daily living were inseparably intertwined. For him, being a Christian meant living a life of constant reflection on God's glory, acknowledging one's unworthiness, and striving to be a part of a holy community. This vision was both inspiring and daunting, and many Genevans found it too much to bear. In 1538, the tension came to a head over a seemingly minor issue: the adoption of certain religious ceremonies from Bern. The Genevans saw this as a way to assert their independence from Calvin's strict rules. They didn't want to be forced into a rigid, biblical purism that would radically change their customs. For them, living according to God didn't mean destroying every bridge to the past. They wanted a more moderate approach, one that retained some of the old traditions, like the few church ceremonies that the Bernese had kept. On March 11, 1538, the Council in Geneva decided to adopt the Bern Order, which was a clear anti-Calvinist stance. The next day, a letter from Bern invited Farel and Calvin to a synod in Lausanne, where they were expected to agree to the new ceremonies. When Farel and Calvin arrived, they refused to comply, stating that they had less of an issue with the ceremonies themselves than with the way they were being forced upon them. They demanded a reconsideration of the whole matter at a general synod. The Council in Geneva, now under anti-Calvinist control, demanded that the Lord's Supper be administered according to the Bern rite at Easter. Farel and Calvin refused, asking for a postponement until Pentecost and a decision from a general synod. The council, however, was determined and even went so far as to forbid the pulpit to an elderly preacher, Curlt, who had criticized the council. On the Saturday before Easter, Curlt was imprisoned for his harsh words against the council. Farel and Calvin, along with their supporters, protested this action and called for a larger council to be summoned. The council in turn demanded that Farel and Calvin comply with the new rite. When they refused, the council forbade them from preaching the next day. Easter Day, 1538, was a tense and dramatic day in Geneva. Farel and Calvin, accompanied by their supporters, went to church as usual. They mounted the pulpits and announced that they would no longer administer the Lord's Supper in Geneva, not because of the Bern rite, but because the city's state was such that the sacred mystery could only be profaned. They described the city's condition in vivid terms, and the crowd's reaction was fierce. Swords were drawn, and the preachers had to be escorted back to their homes through angry mobs. The council, now faced with this crisis, had to make arrangements to replace the Lord's Supper that had not been administered. They decided to hold it the next Sunday and summoned the larger councils to make further decisions. They also asked Pastor Henry de Lamarck to preach in the afternoon, but he refused, fearing excommunication from Farel and Calvin. The conflict between the Genevans and Calvin was not just about religious ceremonies. It was about the kind of life they wanted to live. For Calvin, it was a life of deep commitment and constant reflection on God's glory. For the Genevans, it was a life of freedom and moderation, where they could live as they saw fit, without the constant pressure of religious strictness. This conflict would continue to shape the city and its people for years to come. The next day, April 22nd, the Council of 200 faced a tough decision. They had to decide whether to accept the burn ceremonies and what to do about Farel and Calvin, who had disobeyed the council's orders. The council was unsure, remembering the protests that had happened when Curro was punished. In the end, they decided to accept the ceremonies, but banish Farel and Calvin. The next day, the Conseil General agreed, but made the banishment even stricter. Giving Farel and Calvin only 3 days to leave the city, a bailiff delivered the news to the pastors. Calvin replied calmly, "Well and good. If we were serving men, we would be poorly rewarded, but we serve a great master who will reward us." Farel and Calvin didn't wait for the 3 days. They packed their things and left the same day. April 23rd. They were in high spirits, almost as if they were making a statement. Calvin later wrote in his commentary on the Psalms, "On being violently ejected, I was more joyful than was fitting." For Calvin, this expulsion felt like a release from a calling that didn't suit him, allowing him to return to his studies. The city of Geneva, on the other hand, celebrated their departure. They held a feast and mocked Farel in a carnival-like event. On April 25th, the elderly Carral was released from prison and also expelled. The next day, the council questioned the remaining pastors, Jacques Bernard and Henri de la Mare, about the wedding ceremonies. The pastors agreed that while it wasn't against God for brides to adorn themselves, the specific hairstyles were not important. This answer pleased the council, marking the start of a more moderate Christian era in Geneva. Now we might wonder why Calvin allowed his work to be wrecked over the burn ceremonies. Some, like Lang in his biography, argue that Calvin's stance was both unwise and morally questionable. They say it was foolish to fight over a small issue, and that true fidelity to principles doesn't rule out compromise on minor matters. Calvin never tried to justify his actions later, which might suggest he saw the question marks himself. However, we should consider that what seems small to us might have been deeply significant to Calvin and his contemporaries. They thought in terms of symbols and their meanings, which we often overlook today. For Calvin, the burn ceremonies represented more than just practical details. They symbolized a way of life that he found deeply problematic. The 4 feasts, for example, were a big point of contention. Calvin saw them as a step toward making everyday life too much like a holy day, blurring the lines between the sacred and the secular. He believed that God had set clear boundaries, and anything that blurred those boundaries was wrong. Calvin also saw the burned baptismal fonts and Eucharistic wafers as attempts to make the sacraments too tangible, weakening the spiritual aspect. He didn't want religion to become a show of lively enthusiasm. He believed it needed discipline and restraint. Even though he could have compromised on some points, he felt that the principles at stake were too important. Calvin's stance wasn't just about being stubborn. He wanted the dispute to be resolved through a general Swiss synod, a meeting where all sides could discuss and reach an informed decision. He believed in dialogue, not just imposing his will. When the council demanded his compliance, he refused because he saw it as a matter of principle, not just a minor issue. After leaving Geneva, Calvin and Farel didn't just disappear. They went to Bern, the very place that had sparked the conflict. This might seem surprising, but it shows Calvin's political savvy. He knew that Bern didn't want the Protestant cause in Geneva to fail, especially since it had political implications for Bern's interests in the region. By appealing to Bern, Calvin hoped to find support and possibly return to Geneva. Calvin's journey from Geneva to Bern and his efforts to reopen the gates of Geneva show that he was more than just a stubborn reformer. He was a strategic thinker who understood the broader implications of his actions. Despite the setback, he remained committed to his principles and the cause he believed in, even if it meant facing more challenges ahead. After Farel and Calvin arrived in Bern, they didn't waste any time. They wrote a complaint to the council, pouring out their frustration and indignation. They were upset about how the elderly Curult had been treated and imprisoned. They also defended themselves against the accusations that they were rebels and opposed to the church's rules set by Bern. They argued that they never rejected the rules outright, but wanted to ensure that the church's practices were genuinely building it up. They felt that the council was asking them to make an unworthy compromise, depose Curult in exchange for leaving the issue of ceremonies to the synod. This, they believed, would go against Scripture. The Geneva Council had never given them a chance to explain their reasons, either to the Council of 200, or the people. Instead, the Council passed resolutions and acted without listening. The preachers refused to give communion, not because of the Bern rite, but because they felt it would profane the sacrament, given the city's moral and religious state. They had openly declared this from the pulpit, but the council ignored them. The Geneva Council later claimed that Farel and Calvin's complaint was full of lies. While there might have been some exaggerations or omissions, the main points were true. The issue of ceremonies was just a surface problem masking deeper differences. Surprisingly, the Bern Council, which had a significant influence over Geneva, sent a letter criticizing Geneva's actions. They called the expulsion of the preachers a scandal and a blow to the Protestant cause. Bern insisted that their demands about ceremonies were meant as friendly advice, not as coercion, and they disapproved of how harshly Geneva had treated the preachers. Bern asked for Curult's release, which had already happened, and requested that Geneva consider their points. Calvin was pleased with this outcome, hoping it would lead to a cooling down in Geneva. However, Geneva's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of addressing Bern's concerns, they focused on refuting Calvin's complaints, ignoring the main issues Bern wanted them to consider. They described Farel and Calvin as obstinate and uncooperative, failing to mention that the preachers were never given a fair chance to state their case. It was clear that Geneva was determined to go its own way, with or without Bern's approval. The matter was then referred to the Swiss Synod in Zurich, where both spiritual and secular delegates gathered. Calvin and Farel's case was discussed, and Calvin presented 14 points, outlining his position. He was willing to make some concessions, like accepting the Bern rite for baptism and the use of wafers in the Lord's Supper, but he also insisted on certain conditions. For example, he wanted the bread to be broken during the Lord's Supper, and for the city to be divided into parishes with assigned pastors. He demanded a consistory to handle excommunication and more frequent communion. He also asked Bern to allow the singing of psalms and to ban obscene songs. Calvin's demands were seen as bold and even overzealous by some, but the synod recognized that he and Farel were learned and holy men. The synod's minutes acknowledged the unrest in Geneva and the need to support both the pastors and the church. They suggested that the pastors were now ready to be guided, hinting that they might have been too strict before. The situation was complex, with deep-seated differences between the council and the preachers. Despite the challenges, Calvin remained steadfast in his beliefs, even if it meant making bold demands and risking further conflict. The synod's response was cautious, reflecting the delicate balance between supporting the preachers and maintaining order in Geneva. The events of the summer of 1538 were a roller coaster for John Calvin and William Farel. After their expulsion from Geneva, they found themselves in Bern, a city where they hoped to gain support to return to their former home. However, their journey was far from smooth. In Bern, they encountered Peter Kuntz, a local pastor, who seemed to be their biggest opponent. Kuntz was known for his fierce temper and often insulted Calvin and Farel. The situation was so tense that the other pastors and even the council had to step in to protect them. Calvin and Farel were once kept waiting for 2 hours in an antechamber before being given a hostile reception by Kuntz. This encounter highlighted the deep divisions between the French reformers and the German Swiss. Despite these challenges, Calvin and Farel did not give up. They believed that their return to Geneva was essential for the welfare of the Church. They even appealed to the Supreme Court. Showing their determination, however, their resolve was not always consistent. On one day, Calvin might be eager to return, and on another he might feel that staying away was best. This inconsistency can be puzzling, but it reflects Calvin's belief in divine providence, which he saw as guiding his decisions. Calvin's mood during this time was a mix of determination and doubt. He wrote to a friend that it seemed better to agree to any conditions rather than leave the church in disarray. Yet, a few months later, he wrote that he felt it would be tempting God to return to a place where he had already faced such difficulties. This back and forth shows the complexity of Calvin's character and his deep commitment to what he believed was God's will. During this period, there were signs of hope. Martin Bucer, a respected reformer from Strasbourg, planned to visit Geneva to reinstate Calvin and Farel. However, the journey never happened. Another friend, Grenaeus from Basel, wrote to Calvin and Farel, encouraging them to show Christian humility and patience. These letters reflected the support Calvin and Farel had from other reformers, even if they were facing opposition in Bern. The Bern Council, despite its theological differences, was willing to help Calvin and Farel. They appointed envoys to negotiate with Geneva and arranged for Calvin and Farel to return. The envoys were to present the 14 articles which Calvin had proposed as a basis for peace to the Geneva Council. This was a significant step, as the articles had caused much controversy. On May 18th, the group set out for Geneva. Calvin wrote to Bullinger, a fellow reformer, expressing his hope that Christ would guide their journey. The plan was for the envoys to lead Calvin and Farel directly into the city, where they would have a chance to speak and explain their position. However, things did not go as planned. Just a mile from the city gates, a messenger from the Geneva Council met them, with a strict order to wait until the city decided what to do. Calvin and Farel wanted to defy the order, but the others persuaded them to wait. Calvin later claimed that this decision saved their lives, as there was an ambush waiting for them at the city gate. The envoys then began negotiations with the Geneva Council. The climax came on May 26th, when the Conseil General met to discuss the matter. Initially, the envoys, particularly Ammon and Viret, made a good impression. But then Peter Vandel, one of Calvin's main opponents, produced the 14 articles and read them aloud. This caused an uproar, with many people reacting negatively to the articles. The church discipline proposed by Calvin was called a tyranny, and some even said they would rather die than listen to Calvin's defense. When the vote was taken, a large majority favored upholding the expulsion. The envoys, seeing the result, asked that their efforts not be held against them, as they had only tried to do what was best for an allied city. They were thanked, and the matter was closed. The reformers had no choice but to return to Bern. Calvin was offered a pastorate there, but he refused, citing a divine calling to leave. He left Bern without saying farewell to the council, a decision that reflected his deep sense of divine guidance. This period in Calvin's life was marked by intense struggle and uncertainty. His journey from Geneva to Bern and back again showed his unwavering commitment to his beliefs, even in the face of opposition and personal risk. Despite the setbacks, Calvin's faith in God's providence remained strong, guiding his decisions and actions. Calvin and Farel's journey to Basel was anything but smooth. They faced a harrowing experience when they had to cross the swollen Aire River. The river nearly claimed their lives, but Calvin saw it as a sign of God's mercy. He believed that while the river obeyed God's grace, their own people had wanted to destroy them unjustly. Wet and tired, they finally reached Basel, where they were welcomed by Grenadius. From there, Calvin wrote a detailed letter to the Zurich clergy, describing their ordeal and the difficult situation in Geneva. After 7 weeks, Farel moved on to Nuremberg, where he found his new calling. Their close friendship, though strong, was sometimes seen as a source of trouble by their other friends. They thought that Farel and Calvin, with their different personalities, often spurred each other into rash actions. However, this separation brought a sense of calm and stability to Calvin's life. In August, Calvin received an invitation from Bucer to come to Strasbourg. Bucer, a respected reformer, thought that Strasbourg, with its small but promising French congregation, would be a good place for Calvin to serve. Bucer believed that Calvin's talents could be useful in the religious discussions happening in Germany. At first, Calvin was hesitant. He wondered if he would feel at home in a German city, and if he could accept the responsibilities there. But after some reflection, he saw himself as Jonah, called to a task he initially resisted. He decided to go to Strasbourg without even putting his affairs in order. He preached his first sermon there on the second Sunday in September. During this time, Calvin's letters reveal a mix of emotions. In Basel, he wrote that he and Farel saw their troubles as part of God's will. They were willing to humble themselves and wait for God's plan. In Strasbourg, he admitted that their inexperience and mistakes had contributed to the problems in Geneva, but he also maintained that the church's downfall was not entirely their fault. He believed that their conscience was clear before God, and he hoped that God would provide a better path for them. The Strasbourg years marked a significant turning point in Calvin's life. He transitioned from a young man to a mature reformer. This period saw the publication of a revised edition of his Institutes, a major work that would shape his theology. He also wrote a victory song to Christ and a treatise on the Lord's Supper, which highlighted his unique Eucharistic teaching. Calvin worked on shaping the liturgy and congregational life, and he even got married in Strasbourg. One of the most important works during this time was his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. This commentary shows Calvin's deep commitment to understanding and explaining the Bible. For Calvin, the Bible was not just a historical document, but a living guide to faith and life. He believed that to act for God, one must first know God, and the best way to know God is through the Bible. His exegesis was marked by a careful, objective approach, staying close to the text and its historical context. He also emphasized that the Holy Spirit must bear witness to the truth of the Bible, making it a living word for the reader. Calvin's work in Strasbourg laid the foundation for his later return to Geneva, where he would face new challenges and continue his reform efforts. His time in Strasbourg was a period of growth and preparation, shaping him into the influential reformer we remember today. Calvin's time in Strasbourg was a turning point in his life. It wasn't just a place where he lived. It was where he became a true European thinker. Some people think that this experience broadened his horizons, but Calvin was already a broad-minded person. He didn't see the world in terms of national boundaries. Even when he was a student, he understood different cultures, especially the German way of thinking. His early interactions with cities like Bern, Basel, and Zurich, which were considered German, and his close relationship with the cosmopolitan Bucer, helped him see the big picture of the Reformation. When Calvin wrote letters about the first colloquy to his friend Farel, he showed that he wasn't a newcomer. He understood the people and the situation very well. He wasn't learning new things. He was already a seasoned observer. His later accounts of these events also show that he wasn't just gaining experience. He was already very knowledgeable and had a clear understanding of the issues. He saw the importance of the matter and was zealous for the cause, but he wasn't naive. He knew that people are the same everywhere, and he realized that the success of any endeavor depends on how it is done, not just on its size. After his experiences in Strasbourg, Calvin decided to focus on a smaller, more manageable area. He went back to Geneva, a place where he could have a more direct impact. He learned from the colloquies that large conferences and working with princes and other secular powers often led to compromise and didn't always achieve the desired results. Instead, he formed a center in Geneva from which he could influence the world. He did this through his writings, the calls he and Geneva issued, and the letters he sent to important people. This way, his influence was more personal and effective. Calvin's participation in the German colloquies was important, but not because it broadened his horizons. He already had a broad view of the world. What it did was help him understand how to put his ideas into action. He saw that the best way to advance the Protestant cause was not through large, impersonal conferences, but through a focused, principled approach from a strong center. During his time in Strasbourg, Calvin witnessed a critical moment in the Protestant cause. Emperor Charles V, facing threats from France and the Turks, needed to make peace with the Protestants in the empire. This was a chance for the Protestants to gain significant ground. Calvin knew how to use this situation to their advantage. He wrote a work against Cardinal Farnese, speaking as a German and warning against papal mercenaries. He also tried to form an alliance between the German Protestants and King Francis I of France to strengthen the Protestant cause. Despite his efforts, Calvin was frustrated by the indecisiveness and disunity of the German princes. He saw that their inability to act together was hindering the formation of a strong national outlook. But Calvin's true goal was always to advance the Protestant cause, not to favor any particular nation. His strategy was to play Germany against Rome and France against Germany, all to strengthen the Protestant movement. This approach was shrewd and effective, and it showed that Calvin was a true internationalist, just like his opponents in Rome. In the end, Calvin's time in Strasbourg taught him that the best way to achieve his goals was through a focused, principled approach from a strong center. This is what he did in Geneva, and it is why his influence continues to be felt today.